Welcome to the Rising Latterly podcast.
Each episode, you will learn something fascinating so you can bring big ideas to your small talk.
Your growth is our growth. Listening to these episodes, subscribing to our weekly newsletter, engaging our posts on social media, and sharing our show with your friends and family is deeply appreciated as we work hard to expand this platform. You can also visit our page at buymeacoffee.com to contribute what you think the show is worth.
To the folks who are taking this step, we can't thank you enough. Look for the link in our show notes for more details about how you can support and follow us.
And now, please enjoy this episode.
Rick Taylor is a professor of zoology and director of the fish collection at the Beaty Biodiversity Museum, joining us from British Columbia. He studies the patterns and processes promoting the origins and persistence of biodiversity and the application of such knowledge to conservation, especially in fishes. He graduated with a Ph.D. in zoology from UBC in 1989, spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University, then 18 months as a visiting research fellow at the Pacific Biological Station before returning to UBC in 1993. Between 2000 and 2018, Rick was involved with the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada and was its chair between 2014 and 2018. In 2016, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. Rick is the author of the forthcoming book, Rivers Run Through Us, A Natural and Human History of Great Rivers of North America. In the book, Rick profiles 10 rivers that have influenced the course of human history and development on this continent. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jay and Arjun. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You know, I think a lot of folks can probably take themselves back to elementary school, learning about the Great Nile River in Egypt and how it allowed the Mesopotamians to grow crops, settle down, and create one of the first civilizations in recorded history. I certainly remember as a kid learning about the Nile, seeing it as this tremendous source of life in all its might and influence. It really captured my imagination. But until reading your book, I didn't appreciate how much rivers continued to shape human history all the way up into the present. That critical relationship between river and mankind is not just a story of a bygone era. It's not just a history lesson. It's always been here. And your book really opened me up to that fact. It's a reality that we can easily lose sight of in our increasingly urbanized, mechanized, digitized world, but it's still there. And in your book, Rick, you expressed that you wanted to, quote, embrace the human-river relationship as a continuum of reciprocal interactions where humans and rivers influence one another simultaneously, and such influences are studied together. Can you talk about why you wanted to write this book, Rick, and what you wanted to deliver to the audience with it?
Sure. Good question. It's really, I want to write the book almost as an apologia, in the sense that for much of my life, even though I've been around rivers since a little squidgen, and I study things that live in them, fishes, for almost 40 years, I kind of took the rivers themselves for granted. They were a habitat that fishes lived in, as opposed to sort of things on their own that had their own sort of history, not just with fishes. So, and I really got much more into the interaction. I wanted to get into the interaction between humans and rivers and sort of take off my biologist lens as much as possible and sort of investigate how humanity sometimes works through biology, through fishes and other organisms, how we interacted with these rivers. And I basically wrote the book for myself. And I hoped that by doing that, other people would be interested in sort of trying to understand this relationship more broadly between humans and rivers.
Yeah, I really enjoyed how you likened your book to a number of other single issue books, like you mentioned Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world, or Salt, or Empire of Cotton, a global history. They might seem like one-dimensional topics, whether it's cod or salt or, say, alcohol or rivers, but sometimes single topics have such a profound impact on human development. They really do require their own book to be able to investigate them fully, and you certainly did that for the rivers here in North America. Before we drill down into the specific rivers that you delved into, maybe we can kind of get a bird's eye view of how our great rivers cut through the North American continent. It's probably best for our listeners to maybe follow along with a map here if they can. But in your book, you organize North America's great rivers with the 7-basin model, driven by the formation of 6 major hydrological divides: the Continental Divide, the Laurentinian, the Arctic, the St. Lawrence, the Eastern, and the Great Basin. Can you kind of unpack that model for us and maybe try to paint a picture of how these divides split up the continent?
Yeah, sure. The way I started thinking about it is I sort of asked myself the question, imagine you had a glass of milk on a perfectly flat table and you spilt it over, and the spray of the milk just kind of goes everywhere. Well, that's not the way our rivers are organized in North America. So there must be some sort of overarching organizing feature that channels the flow mostly to the south and towards the west and the east coast, but some, as you see in the book, sort of flow down north, as people in the north like to say it. So, I mean, clearly the structure of the rivers and how they flow is organized by mountain building, and which is going on, including mountain building going on currently, and glaciation are really the 2 great features. So very old mountains like the Appalachians, close to 500 million years old, sort of organized flow from the coastal plain, eastern United States and Canada towards the coastal plain, and the Rocky Mountains, of course, on the other. So here are the Appalachians, and I guess it should be the other way around. This is the Appalachians, and these are the Rockies. They sort of act as this funnel system that drives most of the flow either towards the coast this way or towards the middle and the great sort of master rivers, as I call it, and other people call it, the Mississippi Basin and the Gulf of Mexico. And so most of the features sort of go this way. But there are some divides, as you mentioned, that go sort of horizontally, and that helps to explain why rivers like the Mackenzie, which encompasses 20% of the land area of Canada, and the land area of Canada and the U.S. are pretty equal.
Wow.
So that's a huge river system, and it flows, of course, towards the Beaufort Sea and the Arctic. So it has a divide that pushes it that way, and that's kind of the old deep time template that has been set that channels the rivers. But of course, the last glaciers left North America, and these are sheets of ice that were 2 to 3 kilometers thick. They imposed themselves on certainly all of Canada and northern part of the U.S. directly, up until around 10,000 years ago. So under the ice sheet and north of the ice sheet, the templates for the flow of the rivers were set even more recently than that, in the last 10,000 years. Now, certain rivers like the Rio Grande, Sacramento, San Joaquin, they were not directly impacted by glaciation. They weren't covered by glaciers, but of course, the amount of snowpack and the rate of melting and the extent of melting helped to carve those rivers post-glacial, as we like to call it, much more recently in the last few thousand years.
It's incredible.
It's kind of a mixture of old processes and young processes. And of course, earth movements are going on all the time. It was just a huge earthquake up in Alaska, 8.2 that magnitude, that had undoubtedly had some local impacts on smaller river systems.
Yeah, the rivers are fascinating because, as you mentioned, I mean, they've been carving through our land for a number of years. I mean, 450 million years, or at least 10,000 years ago, depending on if it's coming from a sheet of ice. But that's what's so fascinating about it, because rivers, like, there's an energy to a river, there's a flow and a power to a river. And when you think about it, like, that is just coming from within itself, whether it was just, ice at one point and it's now flowing into one of these major rivers. It's so fascinating to think about. And I just have this fascination with water systems in general, because growing up, a lot of the times when people would come to visit us from like India, like we grew up in New Jersey, we would take an 8-hour road trip up to Niagara Falls. And, they have signs there where it's like, at this point, there's so much flow that it's like 75,000 gallons per second. And when you think about that, it just makes no sense. And so I think there's like this inherent fascination with rivers that humans have. And maybe it's the fact that they kind of look like our veins as well. But what do you think is the fascination with rivers, and how does that tie to humanity? And what was your fascination with rivers?
Well, certainly I think one of the key, as I discussed in the book, it may have to do with the way rivers kind of mirror our nervous system or our circulatory system, whatever. There's some sort of innate connection. It's definitely the movement, I think. I sort of wrestled with there's just, and I love lakes as much as I love rivers, but there's something about the sound and the sight and the visceral feel you get when you see water flowing. It's that sort of expression of power, because it's got this sort of kinetic energy to it, which can be hugely destructive and can be hugely beneficial. I mean, millions of people have been impacted by floods and things like that through history that have created great devastation. So there's a certain amount of reverence, but at the same time, you can't have irrigation. You couldn't have the first sort of settled communities without irrigation, really. And that often at the very earliest stages just meant sort of carving a hole or a channel in the bank of a river and having the water flow down. So it's life-giving and life-taking away at the same time. So I think that that has a real impact on people's psyche. But myself, just exposure. My father was a sort of an amateur outdoorsman. We were always in canoes. We were always fishing, that sort of thing. And I always loved swimming, and I always loved water. So it just sort of drew me towards rivers. But as I mentioned earlier, as I became a scientist, and particularly with a specialty in fishes, obviously you have to learn something about, particularly in freshwater fishes, where a huge number of fishes live in rivers. You got to kind of know something about a river and its behavior in order to study the fishes. So, but again, as I mentioned, that was more of an indirect interest. And it really wasn't until I read a couple of books about rivers, and I can't remember what motivated me to read these books. I really love nonfiction, history, stories of explorers, and I started seeing these rivers keep cropping up in these stories. And two books in particular. One was A River No More by Philip Fradkin, which is the story of, and there's been scores of books written on the Colorado River, of course. And this was basically about, the river's history, its ancient peoples, and its development as part of sort of this idea of the hydraulic West. And what really intrigued me about that book was I had never appreciated the power of the water lobby in U.S. politics. And, it's just particularly the Western states that are all around the Colorado Compact area. And, we talk about the oil industry lobby and, when cigarettes were a thing, the cigarette lobby or the car lobby. Boy, these guys ain't got nothing on these people who fight these water wars in the West and appropriating funds to build more dams and develop more areas, that sort of thing. So that really twigged in me. I said, wow, I never thought of rivers being an aspect of political debate. And that kind of got me really interested in the aspect of the human river relationship. Mm-hmm. And then I started just reading a whole bunch of single, there's lots of individual books. There's a great series called American Rivers series, which was written, I don't know, somewhere through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there's 65 volumes, and they treat each river in America, broadly speaking. So I read lots and lots of those. And then I read one book by a Canadian author, in this case, Hugh McClellan. And that book was called Seven Rivers of Canada. And it was a centennial project, 1967, based on a series of articles for a magazine we have here called Maclean's, where he profiled each of these individual rivers. And in that case, it was mostly sort of things about the fur trade and transportation, and again, human river relationships. But I said, it's 50 years later, this book needs to be updated. And I've read all these books on U.S. rivers. We really need a sort of compilation volume for American rivers as well. And, Mexico's part of North America too. We should have some rivers in there that deal with sort of the Mexican issues. So that's kind of how the idea started. I didn't start out to, I'm going to write a book on rivers. It just kind of said, somebody should do this.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Going back to your first comments there, I think rivers do draw people towards them for their natural majesty. Another reason why rivers draw people towards them sometimes is for their gold. So let's get into it. We want to cover 5 of the rivers that you discuss in the book. The first one will be the Yukon. The Yukon is actually the 3rd longest in North America, as you write in the book. Around 140,000 people live within the Yukon River Basin today, with more than 75% of those people living in Alaska. It earned a spot in your book for its role in the Klondike Gold Rush. But before we get there, can you give our listeners just a sort of potted sense of the Yukon River's geography and its origins? I know there's a lot of history there, but maybe,
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's of course it's a massive river system. It's a transboundary river system because it flows between British Columbia, Yukon, and between Yukon and Alaska. And it starts it's a weird pattern because it starts in Atlin Lake, which is the biggest natural lake in British Columbia. It's a huge lake. In the extreme northwest corner of British Columbia. And it's only about maybe 50 kilometers or 50 to 80 kilometers due southwest to hit the Pacific Ocean. So you think, oh, why doesn't it just punch its way down and flow to the Pacific Ocean? Instead, it goes north, a little bit east, and then northwest, and then west and south and west again, all the way to empty into the Bering Sea, 3,000 odd kilometers later. So it has a very anomalous course in that way. And when you look at the geology of the origin of the rivers, as I treat in each book, and that was a challenge for me because I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not a river scientist, I'm a biologist. But anyway, I read the literature, and in fact, the Yukon used to be actually two rivers. This one here was a much shorter one that flowed actually out to the Gulf of Alaska, and this one up here flowed north and west towards the Bering Sea. And at some point in history, their sort of headwaters joined because of these earth processes. And the southwesterly flowing river was captured by the northwesterly flowing river, and hence we get the current pattern down into the Bering Sea. So every river has a history, and what you see today might not be as it's always been.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. Well, speaking of history and ancient history, you mentioned in the book that gold has been something that humans have valued dating all the way back to the 4th millennium BC. Where gold goes, humans follow. It's been a part of our culture. It's been a part of our industry. It's been a part of our mythology for thousands of years. From a geological perspective, how did gold come to be deposited in the Klondike River, which is a key tributary of the Yukon River?
Right. Well, without getting into the real nitty-gritty details, a lot of the deposits of gold that were deep down were thought to have been generated by sort of celestial giant meteor impacts and that sort of thing that had sort of a chemical a process that created these deep sort of bearing gold deposits. And if you think about the power of a river, as we talked about before, it's these changes in the courses of the rivers and shifting positions of land masses that helped expose those deep sort of lodes to more surface areas, and then the washing of the water, particularly after glaciation, these massive amounts of water washing off these melting glaciers, that helped to expose and dig out these gold deposits to more shallower levels, where someone with a spade and a bucket and maybe a fire to melt the permafrost could actually access these things. And then some of them would be just right amid pebbles in the sort of surface substrate of a creek. And that's basically how the Bonanza Creek, how that was discovered. It wasn't by digging; it was just sitting there glittering in the bottom of the stream.
Yeah, that's quite a sight to come upon. That's for sure.
No kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned between 1896 and 1900, through that Klondike Gold Rush, there was about $6 billion in today's dollars worth of gold that was pulled or dug up. That's a lot.
It's a lot of dough. It's a lot of dough for sure. I mean, you can just see, the thousands of people who basically pulled up stakes. Mayors of cities and police chiefs and people with successful businesses came from all across the world, really, and certainly all across North America, to make this incredibly arduous journey. Most of which, and that's all because of the lure of gold. So it had tremendous, as Pierre Burton mentioned, the sort of collective lunacy that impacts people when they think, oh my God, I can make a lot of money digging up this gold, because it has this sort of the luster of it, the color of it, our mythology behind it. It just has such a draw that all these people pulled up stakes and went up there, and most of them failed.
Yeah, it's like entrepreneurship. There's, when you think about gold, I mean, there's only 1 to 3 parts per billion on Earth or in the crust, and iron is 14 times as abundant. So just think about that. It's pretty funny and fascinating.
It is. It's something about, again, it's like trying to figure out what is it exactly about rivers that attracts people. There's something about the color and the luster and the way they can make it into all sorts of really cool things. It just has this overwhelming power over people.
Mm-hmm. And what, in your mind, is the lasting human legacy of that Klondike Gold Rush? A lot of people maybe made a lot of money, but a lot of people failed. How did that shape the region moving forward, Rick?
Well, it certainly made for a lot of great stories.
Yeah.
Robert Service, Jack London, all those people who made such great stories. Lots of Hollywood movies made about the Gold Rush, Klondike Gold Rush. Well, it certainly established mining is still incredibly important in Alaska, and it really helped to sort of was one of the it was one of the draws for bringing Alaska into the Union, and it just helped to develop that state, which is a very, very important state in the U.S. It also helped to it helped to establish Yukon as a separate territory from other Northwest territories in Canada at the time because of the potential for gold, and gold mining is still very important there, and particularly in places like Dawson City, which was where the Klondike Gold Rush took place. I mean, you go there and you can smell history all around you.
Wow.
It's very, very important to the sort of je ne sais quoi of the people who live in that area. They make money out of it in terms of tourist issues, tourist developments, and that sort of thing. And it's just a very important part of the soul of particularly that part of Yukon.
Yeah.
And of course, it helped make cities like Seattle, which was a mustering point, and people would supply up, and they'd get in Seattle, and then some of them would take barges up to take the Chilkoot Pass, or they'd go all the way around to St. Michael on the lower Yukon River at the Delta. So marshaling points, cities like Seattle and San Francisco, a lot of the development there was driven by the gold rush, even though it was thousands of kilometers to the north.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's amazing how one event with one epicenter can ripple out into the areas in such profound, lasting ways. Well, let's move on then to Sacramento, San Joaquin. That river system is in California's Central Valley. I'm sure many folks are aware that California has been dealing with droughts off and on now, stretching all the way back into the 19th century. We think that probably before that as well. We think a lot about the crisis we've been in, from like 2010 to 2020, but this has been a very enduring problem for the state. And where there are droughts, there are fights over access to water. The Sacramento-San Joaquin system is really central to that fight here in California. But before we get into that, let's once again maybe get a sense of the Sacramento-San Joaquin geography. And you mentioned in the book that there's parts of it that are different from some of the other rivers in your book. What are the kind of defining features of the Sacramento-San Joaquin, Rick?
Yeah, well, it's different in the sense that first of all, I call it a conjoined river. So it's these two river systems, almost direct. Their flows are almost directly opposed to each other. The Sacramento from the northwest, and the San Joaquin from sort of the southeast, and they join kind of at the San Francisco Bay Area. And the other interesting thing is they don't penetrate very deeply inland. So they're mostly sort of coastal rivers, although they're separated by the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevada. So they're in the Central Valley. But and the other interesting thing about those two rivers is, of course, the importance of the estuary and the interaction of the inflow of salt water and the outflow of fresh water. That's very critical to a lot of these issues you're talking about. So it's kind of a minor player in terms of degree of outflow of water compared to something like the Mississippi, the Mackenzie, but it's so critical to how people make their living, which is the thing that really I wanted to get across in the book.
Yeah, and I think you did, because you tied it to the agriculture, and you shared a couple of facts around California's agriculture that I think are worth sharing. Just in 2019, the last year where statistics were available on this type of stuff, but the total value of agriculture products in California was about $50 billion spread over the 400 commodities. Leading the way was milk production, 7.3 billion, almonds, 6.9 billion, grapes, 5.4 billion, and cattle, 3.1 billion. And so, like, when I think about agriculture, the Central Valley, I think about this river.
As I call it, those two rivers by themselves turned California into an agricultural behemoth. It just wouldn't be possible without the water from those rivers.
Yeah. So, and to add a couple more statistics, Arjun's there. So now we're producing almost half of California, where Arjun and I live, is producing almost half of U.S. grown fruits, nuts, vegetables, 14.7% of all U.S. agricultural products, 80% of the world's almond supply. Yet we have an explorer that you include in the book, Charles Wilkes, who I believe it was the 19th century that he said this, called California a barren and unproductive, more or less wasteland. How did it go from that to the agricultural powerhouse that it is today? What technology facilitated that change?
Irrigation and dam building.
Mm.
And this speaks to, it encompasses several of the other rivers in the book as well, and that places like even parts of the central Columbia River flow basically through a desert, but there's all this water. It's just too far away from where the land is. And places like the Central Valley, of course, the Central Valley was under the sea at one time.
Oh,
So there's
wow.
incredibly rich soil deposits that are there,
Mm.
but plants need water in order to grow, and it's essentially growing. They're growing through a desert unless you can generate water storage and irrigation to move the water from where it's going to where it's needed to grow things. The problem is that when you take it away from somewhere to grow things, there's something where you've taken it away that can't use it now.
Right.
So,
Yeah. 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 A little bit of a zero sum game. Well, on that point, you write in the book about a fish known as the Delta smelt. It's a group of soft rayed, silvery, small body fishes that are trout like in appearance. And now I know we're really in your wheelhouse here with the fish. They live in the Sacramento San Joaquin River. How did this fish, which maybe a lot of people might not know about, come to be the center of a major lawsuit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2006 and ultimately an icon in the California water wars?
right. Well, yeah, the Delta smelt is kind of that long. You can't really eat it. I guess you could if you wanted to. It acts as prey for other fish like Chinook salmon that are in that area as well. But it's very, very important because it's endemic. And what I mean by endemic is the only place in the entire world that fish is found is the San Francisco Bay estuary and the associated delta.
Hmm.
So it's part of what makes that part of California different than the rest of the U.S. And it's part, therefore, what makes the U.S. in terms of fish biology and fish distributions different than the rest of the world. It's part of the biotic heritage of California in particular, but also the U.S.
Hmm.
And we think that it sort of became specialized to that intermediate salinity water and evolved from a relative that's found, the surf smelt that's found very widespread from California to Alaska. So that unique environment, and there's all sorts of unique birds and some other fish in that area of the San Francisco Bay and associated delta, created this thing that is now a symbol of what it is to have evolved, if you will, in California.
Hmm.
Now, unfortunately, it has a very narrow window of salinities that it likes. If there's too much push of water in from San Francisco Bay, and that can often result from high tides, but also too little water flowing down the Sacramento San Joaquin River, the salinity becomes too high in most of the delta, which is a very, very productive place for fishes to live. So the habitat of the fish becomes squeezed down to nothing. And if freshwater outflow from the Sacramento San Joaquin is very strong, it tends to push the saltwater out towards the Bay Bridge and increase the suitable habitat for the delta smelt in that area. So lots of freshwater flow is good, low freshwater flow is bad. So you can get drought years quite naturally, where, as you mentioned, California has thousands of years of history of this. You can get drought years where the natural outflow is too low, and that can sort of compress the suitable habitat for the delta smelt. But there's also this need for water to go flowing out from the Sacramento and San Joaquin to the delta and out, as some people would say, wasted to the sea. A lot of that water is sucked out through these massive infrastructure developments, these giant sort of tunnels that suck water out of the Bay Area and send them down, particularly into the San Joaquin River Valley. So the two reasons why that fresh water can be compressed is either because of a drought or because the water is being abstracted or taken away to service irrigation demands. So there's this tug of war. We want the water for the smelt by people who are interested in conservation of natural biodiversity versus the pull of people who want the water to service this behemoth agricultural industry, which is important to many, many people and to the state, to the country as a whole. So you get this tug of war. Any water used for one thing is not available for the other thing.
Right, right. And what was the outcome of that lawsuit in 2006? And what do you think? What do you kind of foresee as the long-term future of this war between agriculture and the conservationists?
Well, there have been several lawsuits, and certainly, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their so-called biological opinion about how to handle this issue was rejected, and they had to go back and redo this sort of biological opinion on the effects of the smelt. So in many cases, it was kind of a stalemate, but a stalemate usually results in sort of no further action until we resolve the stalemate. So often environmental groups can view that as a victory. I mean, right now there's of course, the Colorado River is very important to California as well, and we're in this drought now. And there is the Endangered Species Act, and people have to follow it. And groups can sue if too much water is being released for agricultural purposes. And that's the issue right now, is that there are salmon also, the sort of iconic Chinook salmon in the Sacramento River, and there are juveniles that are dying in the stream because the water temperature is too high and the flows are too low, and that's a deadly combination for oxygen levels. So areas are being required to release more water to service the natural processes in the river and not be used for agriculture. So I don't believe the taps have been turned off exactly right now, but they're pending if things get even a little bit worse. And the agricultural groups are marshaling their forces to try and sue to prevent this cutting off of the taps. But so it's going to go on until there's innovation in the way we irrigate, which there certainly is ongoing, and also we have to try and figure out what the priority is. And this may mean that there'll be fewer farms in the future, fewer opportunities for large-scale farming, because we have to service the rivers and the biodiversity that depends on those rivers first, and then allocate the water. The problem is the water's over-allocated.
Yeah, there's only a finite amount of it to go around. Well, it's definitely a challenge that I think we'll be dealing with well into the 21st century. Another challenge and real tragedy that we'll be dealing with into the 21st century is immigration from Mexico into the U.S. You write a chapter on the Rio Grande in your book, and for the epigraph of your chapter, you quote the lyrics of "Just Across the Rio Grande" by Don Cook and Chick Rains. And the lyrics go, "The lights of Laredo dance on the water and shine in a young man's eyes who stands on the border and dreams of paradise. He's heard crazy stories of how people live over in the promised land. Here they eat 3 meals a day just across the Rio Grande." There are 140 rivers on Earth that form all or part of an international boundary between 2 or more countries. There are 3 between the U.S. and Mexico, and Rio Grande is the largest among them. As you mentioned, it actually covers 2/3 of the total border distance between these 2 countries. You have a quote here in the book that the U.S.-Mexican border has been described as, quote, "an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds," end quote. Before we get into the present crisis we're facing, can you tell us, beyond its length and its current position between U.S. and Mexico at the border, any other interesting features of the Rio Grande's physicality?
Sure. Rio Grande's a good example of a river that wasn't directly impacted by the multiple glaciations we had over the last 2 million years. I mean, its climate would have changed because of the glaciers further to the north, but it's a pretty old system. And, geologists think that it was created sort of in one of these sort of rift systems where you have this valley, and then all of a sudden it drops down, and it's called a graben, and the sort of square-shaped structure that drops down and creates like the Great Rift Lakes of Eastern Africa, those sort of things. So it's the same kind of process that we think generated the Rio Grande. And it's one of these things that, again, it has such a deep history. Again, it's linked to the Yukon in the sense that there was a quest for gold with Spanish conquistadors, etc. They were fundamental to the sort of founding, much of the founding of the river, at least by Europeans. So it's kind of an interesting river that way.
It's also interesting because if you go back to 1830, you might want to tell the story of how it was the Mexican president who wanted to close off the border to the U.S. So how about that time?
Yeah, that's right. I thought that was a pretty interesting observation that I found during the research, was that, there was all this immigration, Texians, et cetera, crossing the border using, Mexican land. And there was, as you mentioned, this move to prevent Americans from moving across the Rio Grande into Mexico. So the tables have turned a little bit. It's useful to know your history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as you write in the book, control of the Rio Grande has gone through a lot of changes of hand. First, it was controlled by the native North Americans, then by Spain, then Mexico, then the Republic of Texas, and now it sits at the border of Mexico and U.S. How and when did the geographical border dividing the U.S. and Mexico, as we know it, take shape? Because often we think of these lines as being immutable, but they're human constructions.
Yeah, well, it took place over variable time periods, and there were border commissions, this sort of thing, and because the river is variable in flow, sometimes there are these issues where erosion of the river creates some area that was in Mexico that's now in the U.S. and or was in the U.S. and now is in Mexico. So they have to negotiate kind of land swaps. So it's a very rivers are dynamic, the borders are dynamic. Particularly one like the Rio Grande that can fluctuate quite a bit. So it's like the border between Canada and the U.S. There were, as I mentioned, there were boundary commissions set up and land purchases, et cetera, to try and finalize it.
Fast forwarding into the present, as it stands today, between 1998 and 2019, a total of 7,805 people died crossing the U.S.-Mexican border. That figure may actually underestimate the total death toll because there are tragically a lot of people who disappear and are never found. Another horrible truth is that there were about 1,600 deaths between 1993 and 1997 that were caused by drowning in the Rio Grande and associated canals, as reported by Mexican officials. So for many immigrants, death is the outcome of their journey, whether it's being murdered by smugglers or dying of dehydration in the desert, or ultimately getting to the border and drowning in the canals of the Rio Grande itself. It seems like it's very unclear what the best solution is to this very complicated humanitarian crisis, but it certainly is an example of nature intersecting with our human civilization and our human ongoings in a pretty powerful way.
Yeah, very, very much so. It's an ongoing tragedy for lots and lots of people who are so desperate that they'll literally risk their lives and the lives of their children to come to the U.S., which is such a fantastic and dynamic country. So it just shows the lure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the topic of sort of the darker side of human life, let's move on to the Mississippi River. It was included in your book for its significance in the American Civil War. I would wager that when most people think of the quintessential American river, they probably think of the Mississippi. At least I do. I think it has kind of home in our collective consciousness. Etymologically, it's actually an Ojibwe word for big river. It drains a staggering 41% of the continental U.S., running all the way from Lake Itasca up in northwestern Minnesota down to the Mississippi Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things that really surprised me reading your book was that the Mississippi is much more ancient than I think a lot of people realize. It's perhaps as old as 250 million years. To put into context, the current science puts the first mammals around 178 million years. So it's got 70 million years on the very first mammal that graced the face of the planet. Pretty extraordinary. Rick, how did this mighty river come to be in the first place, and is it sort of unique for its size on a global level?
Well, I wouldn't say it's unique. It's certainly one of the longest and largest rivers in the world, and of course, it discharges a massive amount of sediment into the Gulf of Mexico. And yeah, its antiquity really rests in the fact that it's right in the so-called basement of North America. This thing we call a craton, which is sort of this very, very stable part of the continent that doesn't have mountains uplifting all the time or massive earthquakes and that sort of thing. So it's a relatively stable. It has some disturbances, obviously, but it's relatively stable compared to places like the Rocky Mountains or the Appalachians and the faults, et cetera, that go through there. So that's basically the reason why it's so old, is that it was, well, first of all, the vast majority of it is below any of the sort of lines of glaciation, and also the bedrock in which the landscape through which it flows has been so stable for so many hundreds of millions of years. So that's kind of why it's old. That's why it's Old Man River. That's one way you could think of it, as being Old Man River.
Yeah, that makes sense. The Civil War, I think to many of us, seems like a long time ago, but thinking about the the Mississippi being 250 million years old, it's amazing how much the Civil War is still in recent history for that river, given all the different evolutions of animal life, plant life, human life that it's seen over the course of its history. But let's speed up to 1861, the start of the Civil War that was fought between the seceding Confederacy in the South and the Union armies from that year to 1865, 4-year war, as many of us know. What were some of the key reasons, Rick, why keeping control of the Mississippi was such a strategic asset to the Confederacy?
Yeah, well, really the two, the two basic reasons are because it flows, the Mississippi per se flows so north and south in such a north and south direction. Basically, it would, if you could capture it, it would basically cut the Confederacy in half, because you'd have Texas and Arkansas on one side and most of the other states on the other side. So, and the flow of resources through the Rio Grande and Matamoros, Texas, those areas to the Confederacy east of the Mississippi River was very, very important to the sort of Confederate war effort. So if you could cut that off by controlling the flow of goods up and down the Mississippi or across the Mississippi, you could really put a dent in the power of the Confederate war effort. And I believe this is correct. There were also several, well, I know it's correct. There were several railroad crossings that came from the west and came from the east that would have to cross the Mississippi either by a bridge or by barging. And again, if you could control that choke point, then you could control a lot of the Confederate war effort. As well, I mean, it's also just an iconic rivers along there, like, or in the drainage basin, because we've also got rivers like the Ohio that are very important tributaries, but icons of the Confederacy, like Vicksburg, right on the Mississippi, New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy. If you could control those, you could also control access points and transportation points and marshaling points, but you could also control a lot of the psyche of the Confederate war effort. It would break the back of the morale of the Confederacy if you could capture these key cities, which of course they did. So Lincoln was very bright, and Stanton, his war secretary, were very bright, and this was part of their overall strategy, was to get control of that river, particularly the southern half of the river.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Speaking of humans' relationships with rivers, the fact that if the Union taking this natural feature of the land that held such emotional significance to the Confederacy and to the people that lived there, that blow to their morale was enough to be a major strategic consideration in the war. It just kind of shows you people's connection with the land that they attach to.
Very much so. Good. Very good point.
And that attachment happened like more than 6,000 years ago, because as you write in the book, I mean, that Mississippi River Basin was like one of the independent sources of plant agriculture and one of those central locations where people were coming and, I guess, planting things. So there's significance there beyond the Civil War that I think is pretty interesting as well. And I mean, even if you go in like the mid 1600s, you had explorers like La Salle exploring it for, I guess, France. So yeah, there's a lot of history with the river.
Huge amount. And, a lot of that, particularly the upper river and even the whole river, explored by French Canadians. And so there's a large international component to the sort of history of the Mississippi as well.
Yeah.
And I know for Jay, he thinks it's it's America's river. For me, though, America's river is Hudson. I mean, I'm from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in the Northeast. That's the river, the Hudson River. Tell us about the Hudson River a little bit.
Sure. The Hudson, I should explain, your viewers may go, like, my goodness, the guy's talking about gold rushes, he's talking about agriculture, now he's talking about the Civil War, now they're talking about the Hudson River and all. What's going on here? That was intentional. I wanted to choose as diverse a set of topics as possible to illustrate how widespread the influence of rivers on the North American experience has been. So the Hudson, kind of a puny river. I mean, it's the smallest one. It's barely over 500 kilometers. Small drainage area, kind of tucked up in this corner of northeastern United States. Of course, it has the world's greatest financial center at its mouth. So its impact in terms of opening trade routes and exploiting trade routes between Dutch settlers, English settlers, indigenous peoples, Canadians. Very, very important. Its role in the U.S. Revolutionary War was also important as sort of this geography of warfare aspect that I talk about. And of course, its impact on the development of New Amsterdam and New York City as the world's greatest financial center. That didn't happen by accident. It happened on the banks of a river, or two rivers, the East River and the Hudson River. But in the Hudson River, so it's also kind of interesting because it's short and it flows almost directly north and south.
Yeah, that was the coolest part.
That's the
one
coolest
degree,
part.
degree of longitudinal separate, or I don't know how you described it, but basically from source to the end, it only moves 1 degree of longitude. But then in contrast, the Columbia River moves 9 degrees in longitude.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And it just goes to show. I hope I can say this. That river. People say, "What's the biggest river in the world?" Well, do you mean its length? Do you mean its level of discharge? Do you mean its elevational change? There's so many ways to describe the greatness of a river. And I wanted to pick the Hudson in particular because it's so small and so seemingly insignificant in a geographic context, but it's had such an outsized impact on U.S. history. And in particular, I wanted to explore something that I actually know nothing about, and I have zero skills at, and that is art. I wanted to have some aspect of the arts that I could explore through a river. And of course, that brought me to the Hudson and the Hudson River School of Landscape Art, which is just another great image or another great manifestation of what it means in the myriad ways it means to be an American. This is one of the ways that contributes, the Hudson River School of Landscape Art.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you read about how in the 1800s, there were some American artists that were starting to get notoriety around the world, but we didn't really have, as you put it, a thematic school of art. And relative to our counterparts in Europe, who had been established for centuries, we were a very young nation. We only been around for about 100 years. But the Hudson School of Landscape Art really changed that. That was the school that gave us a national identity, gave us the foundation for a national identity by first giving us a visual identity and an artistic identity. I think from a human perspective, just thinking about how art can tie us together as a society can kind of create the foundation for a national identity of a burgeoning country. It's really fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I thought it was a really interesting thing to explore as well. And you have to you think about, there's some I thought they're great quotes, and I can't remember them, but people, if they read the book, they'll see them by sort of European art critics.
I got one for you if you want me to read it off. Yeah,
sure, go ahead. It's fantastic.
It's hilarious. Yeah, the British critic Sidney Smith he asked the rhetorical question in 1820: in the four corners of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue? Definitely a dig at us.
Yeah, it's definitely a dig for sure. And of course, the Hudson River School and writers that emerged kind of around the same time were a great response to that. You have to think a lot of these European countries had 1,000 years head start, so it's kind of an unreasonable attitude. The West was, at that time, the West was kind of, just barely west of the Mississippi River, not all the way up to even northwestern Alaska. So there was a lot that Americans, at least of European origin, had to do in order to make their life livable before they could engage in the niceties of developing an art school. So it's all very natural. And that's a great quote.
Just growing up on the East Coast, I'll tell you about the Hudson River. Every spring and summer, you would hear on the news a lot about dead bodies showing up. And so Hudson River is kind of known for the amount of bodies that are in it. But what's interesting about it scientifically is that a lot of the bodies that may have gone in through accident or by whatever case, if they were put in the winter, they didn't show up until the spring. And that's because the dead body actually fills up with bacteria, which starts to metabolize once the water gets north of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that metabolism starts to create a gas, which is why the body starts to lift. And then in the spring or summer, you'll start to see them at the top of the river when they were at the bottom of the river in the winter.
Now that's something I hadn't thought about writing about, but I don't know if Tony Soprano was responsible for some of those.
Allegedly,
yeah.
Yeah, maybe we need a new great American painting of the Hudson River depicting that. Moving forward here into the future, We've talked in the beginning of the conversation about how rivers are very much, a symbolic representation of life via flow, via movement. They have this certain homology to our circulatory system. I think humans have a natural affinity for rivers. When you're around one, you sort of feel like you're a kindred spirit with that river. And it is a painful thing to know that we're not taking particularly good care of them. What, Rick, in your mind, are the greatest ecological challenges facing the rivers of North America? Maybe what rivers are in the most dire shape, and what do you think we have to do about it as a collective moving forward into the 21st century?
Yeah, of course, excellent question. I mean, undoubtedly, certainly for the western half of North America and the southwestern half of North America, climate change and reducing input from snowmelt and precipitation into these rivers is the big issue. Not only for a sustainability of biological processes that require a certain amount of water flow, but for humans' use of these rivers. We talked about the cuts that might come to California growers in the Sacramento San Joaquin. So we're all going to be impacted by this. Even if I never see the Sacramento San Joaquin, I'm going to pay for it by paying more for almonds next time I do it. So there's no question that climate change is the biggie. And some rivers, particularly those in like the Mackenzie or the Yukon, might actually see increased flows. But this isn't necessarily a good thing, because that can impact the level of melting of permafrost and things like that. And of course, flooding itself causes lots of damage. There's parts of the Mississippi that might see increased flow, particularly in the winter. And we all know what floods can do in the Mississippi River to people who live in the floodplain. So climate change is the biggie. But the sort of overarching issue that climate change is really just a symptom of, and I don't mean just to dismiss climate change because it's a biggie, is just the human footprint. The Earth has finite level of resources. Rivers have finite levels of water in them. And we sort of have to rethink the way we use rivers, the way we interact with them. And this isn't an original thought of mine. Sandra Postal, who does a lot of work, and Brian Richter on river conservation, in their book written now 15 or close to 20 years ago, sort of talk about this idea of a sustainability boundary. So we have to let rivers be rivers, give them the water that they need to be a river, to sustain all the biological processes, the vegetation that's around them, all the seasonal patterns and flow, maintain those, decide what those levels are, and then the surplus you can then use for human endeavors. Unfortunately, we're kind of way past that. So, for instance, the Colorado River Compact that was orchestrated in the 1920s based the apportionment of water to all the contract states based on water flow levels that are now way out of date. We're actually anomalously high. So it's known as a sort of oversubscribed river. There's too much water being taken out of it, given the amount of water that's going into it. So we have to rethink the way we use water from rivers to give them what they need to be rivers, and then we can take the surplus. Unfortunately, and it's just part of the human way we do things. We're so enthusiastic about development and getting in and improving people's lives, which is a good thing, and obviously, that sometimes we don't have all the facts about the biological or the geographical world around us in order to make wise decisions. And we embark on a developmental strategy before we really understand the constraints. And we're going to face that big time, because climate change is squeezing those constraints even more like this.
What color can you add to anyone who right now is thinking about the pollution in our rivers or the invasive species that are in our rivers? What can you add around that?
Well, there are some great successes. So, things like acid rain was dealt with, pretty well in the sort of 70s and 80s. That was a clear and present threat to many aquatic systems. So if we do have the science and we do have the willpower, we can actually make change that can improve the water quality of areas, including rivers and lakes in North America, as sort of the attack on acid rain. The program against acid rain demonstrated. But it really comes down to having sort of an like the U.S. Everything's so fragmented, and same in Canada. We have really no overarching sort of system in which to monitor and act upon water quality issues in rivers, lakes across the U.S. at a sort of national standard. It's all statewide, and many of the state standards are excellent, but there's so much variation. Some of these rivers flow through multiple states. So if one state isn't carrying the ball properly and the other one is, then that creates a problem for the river that flows through those areas.
Mm.
So it's really rethinking how we go forward in terms of development. And some people, have some pretty radical ideas about, how to change this obsession with, growth and economic growth in terms of GDP and that sort of thing. We should be more thinking about a human well-being index, and that would include environmental factors that could help sort of take it away strictly from how many of these things are produced every year.
Yeah, that makes sense. We actually just had a conversation last week about that same theme. Ultimately, if people can find joy in taking a bike ride in their backyard as opposed to getting on a plane to travel to another city or getting in their car to travel to the mall, over time, that could be part of the solution, just finding joy in nature and the simpler things, if you're privileged enough to have access to nature.
Sure.
Well, before we let you go, Rick, we have one more question for you that we've been asking all our guests the past couple months here. If you could be any animal for a day, what would you be and why?
Wow, what a question to ask to a zoologist.
Yeah.
I've got 35,000 fishes alone to choose from. Great question. Interestingly, I thought about this independently times throughout my life. I guess a lot of people do. I would say a bald eagle.
Interesting.
And the reason for that is a lot of humans, I often have a recurring dream where I can fly. And I think apparently this is quite common. So just to see them soar in the air, not only are they beautiful to watch, but they clearly have command of their aerial performance. It's just amazing to watch them, and that the view from up there must be incredible. The other reasons, I guess, maybe are they're pretty much a top predator. Nothing's going to go after them once they reach adult stage, and they're around lakes and rivers, which I like to be. So I guess I'd pick a bald eagle.
Yeah, I like that.
Love that.
Well, we while you're here, we actually did an episode 2 on animal consciousness about a month ago, kind of exploring what it might like to be an octopus, or what it might like to be kind of, having that first person subjective view out onto the world as a raccoon or as a raven, all these different animals. As a fish, you obviously know quite a bit about them and their level of intelligence. What do you think it's like to be a fish in terms of what their conscious state might be? Can you ever put yourself in their shoes?
Oh boy. I'm not sure I can. I mean, I've certainly snorkeled with lots of fish. And certainly, and I'm an angler, and times when a fish is struggling, I think something like that I could probably relate to, because everyone has struggles every now and then. I don't have a hook coming out of my mouth.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That sort of concern for one's well-being or well-being around them, I think I can sort of relate to. But I'm just always amazed by how most of the time happy they seem to be, and how preoccupied they are with either interacting with another fish or trying to get something to eat. In some ways, it seems like kind of an ideal life. You've got such your needs are so immediate. They don't have all this other stuff that we have to think about. It's like I have a dog, and the dog's got the greatest life in the world. It gets fed, it gets walked, it gets loved. Doesn't have to do anything except look at you nicely every now and then.
Yeah, they're not overthinking, and they don't know it all. It's pretty pretty awesome.
Exactly.
All these other animals.
Exactly. Sorry, as one of my colleagues said, humans are too smart by half, but perhaps not smart enough.
Yeah,
I like that.
We know a lot of stuff, and then we know a lot of nonsense as well.
Yeah.
Now, I got to say, though, reading your book, it was amazing, because in the intro, or in one of the earlier chapters, you literally talked about something that described the reason we actually started this podcast, where you basically said, hey, I'm going to take one topic, rivers, and I'm going to see how this links to everything else. And the original thing that we did with Rising Laterally was, let's take one topic and intersect it across different history or different psychology or different philosophies, and try to figure out, okay, where are the points of growth and where are the points of ignorance? And so when I hear you, or when I read you taking this one-dimensional topic and then like linking it to so many different things. I mean, it was just a fascinating read. So I appreciate the contribution and the work that you did there.
Oh, I appreciate that. I don't want to keep it too long, but I have to give credit to other people on that, because I have a good friend who's an author of several fine books, Tim Faulkner, and we were on a canoe trip once, and we talked about doing this book together. And he's got a book coming out called Klondikers, which is about a hockey team that traveled across Canada, played a game, and how Canada fell in love with hockey. But anyway, we talked about writing this book together because he's an actual author. I mean, I've written dozens and dozens of scientific papers, but to write a book is a totally different thing, which I think is so cool. And we talked about doing it together. And I think kind of together we came up with this idea, because I said, there's no way the Mississippi has so many amazing stories, and he wanted to talk about music, and I wanted to talk about the Civil War, because I have an interest in U.S. history. And so we sort of decided, well, I think maybe one topic for each one, and diversify across rivers for different topics, and you'll get the message across without going into too much detail. So yeah, there's definitely a similarity between your podcast and that philosophy for sure. Yeah, I like that.
We would love to have Tim on one day as well.
He'd be a great interview, probably much better than myself.
Oh no, well, we enjoy this conversation. Yeah, I mean, to Arjun's point, awesome. We covered a lot of ground. Covered agriculture, gold rush, the crisis of immigration, war. There's so many other human topics as they relate to rivers in your book. St. Lawrence, the Columbia River, the Colorado River, all those were rivers we weren't able to get to today. I did want to end with a quote that you have in your book from Henry David Thoreau. I'm actually from Concord, Massachusetts. So just as Arjun wanted to highlight the Hudson, I got to highlight my friend here, Henry David Thoreau. He says, "He who hears the rippling of rivers in these degenerate days will not utterly despair." I thought that was a simple idea, but certainly a resonant one. I think if we can all find the river nearest to us and maybe go out there and spend some time with it, we'll know what he means. The book is Rivers Run Through Us, A Natural and Human History of Great Rivers of North America. The publication date is October 1st. It's not out yet, but you can pre-order now. I recommend you do. Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the interest in the book and how it came about. I really enjoy your show.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're helping us grow. We appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.